The ice didn't make a sound when it started to give. That's what I remember most clearly, all these years on. Not a crack, not a groan, not the kind of noise you'd expect from something failing under you. Just a slow, soft settling, like the whole surface was taking a breath inward, and Bess went rigid under my hand at the same moment, her lead rope pulling taut, her breath coming in short white bursts that hung in the 12-degree air and disappeared. I had walked that crossing 300 times if I had walked it once. I knew that creek. And something was wrong with it that morning that my body understood before the rest of me caught up. But to understand what happened at that crossing, I need to go back a little ways. To the 32 years that put me on that bank, and to the woman who made the route worth walking, and to the 3 winters I had been carrying her absence like a stone in my coat pocket, heavy enough that I had stopped noticing the weight. I was a mountain midwife for 32 years. That is not a thing people say easily in this part of Appalachia anymore because the practice is mostly gone, and the word sounds like something from a history book. But that is what I was. I had trained under a woman named Aura Deal, who had trained under her own mother, and I had learned the route from her, every hollow and ford and steep-banked switch in the trail. There were 4 hollows I served, spread across a ridge that took 3 hours to walk end to end if the weather held. If it didn't hold, you added an hour for mud and another for ice, and you walked anyway, because the babies didn't wait for clear skies. Bess was with me from the beginning. She was a compact grey mule, steady-tempered to a degree I have never seen matched in a horse or a person, with 1 white sock on her left rear leg and a habit of leaning her head against my shoulder when she thought I was taking too long to make a decision. She carried the kit bags, the clean linen folded in oilcloth, the dried herbs Ruth put up every autumn, and, occasionally, a woman in hard labour who could not walk. Bess understood the route as well as I did. I have thought, more than once, that she understood it better. Ruth came with me on summer walks when her knees allowed it. She was not a midwife, had no training in it, but she knew people, and she had a way of sitting in a kitchen while I worked that made the whole family calmer. She would drink whatever was offered and ask about the garden or the children already born, and by the time I was done, the family felt like she'd been their neighbour for years. She died 3 winters before the late February morning I am going to tell you about. Cancer, the kind that moves fast once it decides to move. 91 days from diagnosis to the morning, I sat in the kitchen and understood that the second cup I had just set out on the counter was not needed, and would not be needed again. I kept setting it out anyway. Not as a decision, not as a ritual I had named or defended to myself. Just as a thing my hands did in the mornings before my mind was fully awake. Set the percolator on the burner, get down 2 cups from the cabinet by the window, fill them both, and then stand there looking at the second one until the reality of the morning reasserted itself. Then I would pour it back and go on with the day. By that late February, I had been doing that for 3 winters. Pour it out, go on with the day. My son Danny and I had not spoken in 8 months. I want to be fair about why, because I don't think he was wrong to pull back. Grief does things to a person's face. It closes something up behind the eyes, and after a while, the people who love you can't find you in there anymore. Danny had called every month or so after Ruth died, and I had answered and said the right words, and he had heard that his father was not in the room, and eventually the calls came less often, and eventually they stopped, and I had not called him to close the gap because I could not find a way to explain what was in the gap. 8 months. I had his number memorized. I had not dialed it. The route kept me functional. Not well, not at peace, not any of the things that people want you to be when they ask how you're managing. Functional. I walked the 4 hollows as I had always walked them. I delivered 9 babies in the year after Ruth died, 7 in the second year, 6 in the third. The families in those hollows had mostly known me for decades, and they had the good sense not to ask me more than I could answer. They took what I brought and said thank you and sent me home with jars of preserved things. And Bess carried the jars, and I walked ahead of her and kept my head down. The morning that changed things was the last morning of a night delivery. The Breedlove family up in the third hollow, third child, no complications. I had arrived at 10 in the evening and the baby came at 2:30 in the morning, a girl they planned to name Clara. By 4 o'clock the mother was sleeping and the father had the older children settled and I had packed the kit bags and said my goodbyes. 12 degrees, the thermometer on the Breedlove porch read. A dusting of snow had come through around midnight and left a thin white layer over everything, light enough that you could see the shape of rocks through it, fine enough to drift. Bess was calm on the uphill stretch and calm through the first 2 fords, both of which were shallow enough that I could see the gravel through the water and trust the footing. She followed my lamp without complaint, and her breath made a steady fog ahead of us in the dark. I was tired the way you are after a night birth, not depleted but settled, the particular quiet that comes after work done right. I was thinking about nothing. That was not unusual for me by then. The route had become a place where thinking stopped and moving continued, and I had come to depend on that quality of it. Flat Creek Crossing is about 40 minutes into the return route. It is a wider ford than the others, thigh-deep in spring, ankle-deep in late summer, and variable in February, depending on what the weather has done in the 2 weeks prior. I had been across it 2 days earlier, and it had been solid, maybe 4 inches of clear ice from bank to bank, firm enough to walk without concern. 2 nights of temperatures above freezing in the intervening days, I learned later, and then a hard drop back to the teens, had left the surface looking sound while the ice underneath had thinned to something that would not hold a man and a mule. The dusting of snow covered any surface change. To my lamp in the dark before first light, it looked exactly as it had looked 2 days before. I have to be honest about what I was noticing and what I wasn't. I was tired and I was not in the habit of being fully present to the world around me. That had been true for 3 winters. The route moved through me more than I moved through it, if that makes any sense. I was registering landmarks, yes, because the body learns its way and holds it, even when the person inside the body is somewhere else. But I was not reading the creek the way I should have been reading it. I walked down to the bank and my lamp swung over the surface, and I saw what I expected to see, which is what the grief-tired mind does best. Bess stopped at the bank and would not step onto the ice. If you have ever worked with mules, you know that their stubbornness is rarely random. A horse might spook at shadows. A mule generally stops for a reason, even if the reason is not immediately visible to the person holding the lead rope. I had learned this from Bess over 32 years of shared trail, and I knew it as a principle, and I still took her lead rope and clucked at her to come on, because I was cold and tired and ready to be home. She backed up 1 step. Not nervously, not in a spook, just a firm, deliberate refusal. Her ears forward and pointed at the ice in front of us. I moved up beside her and put my hand on her neck and felt that she was not trembling, not afraid in the way a frightened animal is afraid. She was alert. There is a difference, and I knew the difference well enough to pause. I stepped 1 boot onto the ice, testing. The surface gave no sound. I shifted weight, and it gave the smallest, softest flex underfoot. So small that in another state of mind I might have called it normal Cold Creek variation, and walked on. My body understood that flex the way it understands a step that is shorter than expected in the dark, that sudden lurch of recalibration. Something went tight across my shoulders, and I stepped back off the ice without making a decision to do so. My body made the decision. My mind was still trying to explain what I had felt. That was when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, or not the kind of sound I can name cleanly. Something large was in the trees to my left, upslope from the creek bank. And whatever it was moving deliberately and without haste, the way a person moves through familiar ground when they are not trying to be fast, but are trying to be particular. The sound was the sound of weight displaced in snow. Not the quick, light crunch of a deer moving away, not the careless crash of a bear blundering through brush. Something that was choosing where it put its feet. Bess turned her head toward the sound, and her ears tracked it, and she did not shy. That was the thing I noticed even in the moment. She tracked it the way she tracks a sound she has heard before and has decided is not a threat. Like a neighbor's voice coming from the far side of a barn. She knew something that I didn't. I am not a person who believes in things I can't put my hand on. I want to be clear about that because what comes next will test your patience with me if you don't know that about me first. 32 years in these hollows will make you careful about what you claim to know, because the mountains have a way of humbling anyone who gets ahead of their evidence. I have seen lights on ridges that turned out to be lanterns. I have heard sounds in the night that turned out to be wind. I have a working explanation for most things, and when I don't have one, I wait. The moving in the trees stopped. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than before. Not empty, present. Bess stepped forward, not onto the ice, away from it, upstream along the bank, and the direction she chose was the direction the sound had come from, and then stilled. I followed her because I had been following her for 32 years, and I was not going to start second-guessing her now. We moved along the bank maybe 60 yards upstream, where the creek bent around an outcrop of limestone and the water ran shallower and faster through a gravel ford I knew existed, but had not used in years, because the flat creek crossing was faster, and I had been lazy about it. The ford was clear water over bare gravel, not more than 6 inches deep, easygoing. Bess walked into it without hesitation, and I followed, and we crossed without incident. On the far bank I stopped and held the lamp up and looked back across toward the ice we had not crossed. In the grey beginning of dawn, I could just see the surface of it from this angle, and what I could see was that the snow covering it had a faint depression running along the centre line, a subtle sag that you would not see walking toward it, but that was visible in low, raking light from the side. The ice was thin enough to have already begun bowing under its own surface tension. I would have gone through. I stood on that far bank for a long time. Bess stood beside me and waited, and I held the lamp and looked at the creek and tried to build an explanation for how we had gotten from the near bank to this gravel ford, and the only explanation I had was that Bess had led us, which was true as far as it went, but did not account for the sound in the trees, or the specific direction of her first step, or the fact that she had made that step with complete calm, as if following a path she had been shown. I told myself it was her instinct. That was explanation number one, and it was not wrong exactly, but it was not the whole shape of the thing, and I knew it even then, walking the last hour home in the cold, grey morning. I want to pause here for a second because this is the part of the story where I know what a person is supposed to feel, and I am not sure I felt it. I was not afraid. I was not certain of anything. I was tired and cold, and I had just been walked away from a crossing that would have put me in dangerous water in 12-degree weather, and I was going home to a house where the second cup would go out and come back in, and the phone on the wall would sit silent. I was not at the edge of revelation. I was a tired old midwife going home. What I was, for the first time in 3 winters, was paying attention. When I got back to the house, I fed Bess and put her in her stall and went inside and made the coffee. I set out 2 cups. I filled them both. I stood at the counter and looked at the second one, the steam rising off it in the cold kitchen, and I did not pour it back. I went out again at first light. I don't know exactly why. I told myself I wanted to check the Flat Creek ice in full daylight, which was a reasonable enough reason, and I pulled on my coat and my barn boots and walked the 40 minutes back out to the crossing. Bess watched me go from the pasture fence and did not follow. At the crossing, in full morning light, I saw what I had not been able to see in the dark. Laid across the approach to the ice, from the near bank to the point where the ice began, was a line of branches. Hemlock branches mostly, with a few birch. Laid in a clear, deliberate line across the width of the approach, not tangled or blown, not in any arrangement that wind or water or an animal moving through would produce. They were placed, the way you would place them if you wanted to mark something that should not be walked across, the way you would lay them to say, "Stay back from here." I stood at the bank and looked at those branches for a long time. I measured one of them against my boot. I set my boot against the end and walked the span. 8 feet, roughly, the width of the approach. I counted the branches, 11, laid parallel, each touching the next, the whole line running bank to bank, as if drawn with a purpose. That was explanation number 2's end. I had told myself at dawn that some shift in the snow had moved debris to the bank, that the creek had pushed material up in the night. Standing there, looking at 11 hemlock branches laid in deliberate sequence, I could not make that explanation hold. I tried. I looked at the current. I looked at the snow on the banks. I looked at the slope of the ground and considered whether the branches could have rolled there. They couldn't. The largest one weighed better than 30 pounds. I know, because I lifted it. I have carried things a long time that I could not put down. Ruth's second cup is the plainest example. I set it out every morning and poured it back every morning, and somewhere in that daily repetition was the closest thing I had to honesty about what I was still carrying. It was care without a recipient. It was a habit of attention that the thing I was attending was no longer there to receive. I had not thought about it that way, not consciously, not in words. But standing on that bank looking at 11 hemlock branches laid carefully across a crossing that would have killed me, I thought about it that way. Someone had been watching. Whatever had moved in those trees the night before, whatever had been present in that specific quality of silence on the far bank while Bess and I stood in the gravel ford, it had been close enough to see how I walked this route, and it had done something about what it saw. The way you do something when you watch a person walk toward a thing that will hurt them, and you have the means to intervene. The way you lay a line across a crossing and say, "Not this way, go around." That is when I saw it. I had turned to walk back to the ford, back toward home, and I looked up because the quality of the light changed, the way it does when something large shifts position between you and the low morning sun. At the margin of the hemlocks on the far bank, maybe 40 yards off, something stood that was not a tree. 8 feet tall is my best estimate. Dark, not black, but the deep brown-grey of old bark, and still in a way that living things of that size are rarely still. Not tense, not coiled, not in any posture I would call threatening. Still the way a person is still when they have come to see a thing, and have seen it, and are now deciding whether it is time to go. I did not move. Bess was not with me. I had nothing to ground me but my own feet on the frozen bank and the lamp I was still carrying unlit in my right hand, and I stood and I looked at it, and it stood and looked at me. and the silence between us was the same kind of present silence I had felt in the night. Not empty, not threatening. Full of something I do not have a precise word for, though I have been looking for one ever since. Its face I could not fully make out in the light. The sun was behind it and low, and I was mostly reading silhouette, but the posture was unmistakable, and the care with which it held itself still was unmistakable. It was not hiding. It had been there, at that margin, long enough to have settled into the spot. It was letting me see it. That is the only reading that made sense to me then, and that still makes sense to me now, though I hold that reading carefully, because I know I am making an interpretation from the outside of something I cannot get inside of. We stood there, the two of us, for what I judged to have been about 3 minutes. The cold was still sharp. My breath still came out white. The creek ran over the gravel ford behind me with its ordinary sound. Then it moved. Not away exactly, not with any urgency. It stepped back into the hemlocks the way a person steps back from a window when the conversation is done. 1 step, 2, and the gap in the trees closed around it, and the quality of the light returned to what it had been, and the silence went back to being the ordinary silence of a frozen February morning. I stood on that bank for a while longer, long enough for my feet to go from cold to painful, and for my breath to slow all the way down. I looked at the hemlock branches. I looked at the margin of trees where it had been. I looked at the ford behind me. Then I turned and walked home. The kitchen was warm. The coffee was long past hot. The 2 cups were on the counter where I had left them, and the second one was cold now, and I stood there and looked at them both. And I thought about what it means to keep a habit of care when the thing you are caring for is gone. I thought about whether that habit has any witness. I had spent 3 winters assuming it had none, because the person who had always been the witness was not there to witness it anymore. I was not so sure, standing in that kitchen, that I had been right about that. I picked up the second cup and poured the cold coffee into the sink and rinsed the cup. And then I thought about what I was doing, and I set the cup back on the counter, clean, waiting for the next morning. Then I went to the wall and I picked up the phone and I dialed Danny's number. It rang 4 times and I was building myself up to the machine when he answered. He said hello the way you say it when you don't recognize the number, careful and a little flat, and I said, "It's your dad." There was a silence. Not angry, just surprised. The kind of surprise that has to reorganize itself before it can answer. I said, "I've been off somewhere. I shouldn't have stayed so long." He didn't say much to that. He said, "Yeah, I know." I said, "I'm sorry for that." "I know that's not enough." He said, "It's something." "That's?" "Yeah." The sentence didn't finish. I understood why. There are things that don't finish, and trying to finish them does more harm than leaving them open. I told him I would call again the following Sunday, in the afternoon, and he said, "Okay." That was where we left it. 1 cracked open door, and 2 people standing on either side of it, not quite ready to walk through. It was enough to go on with. The weeks after that were ordinary in most of the ways weeks are ordinary. 2 more births in the hollows. 1 false alarm that had Bess and me out in a late March sleet, for nothing but a mama with anxious indigestion. The ice came off the creek in the first warm days of the month, and by late March, Flat Creek was running high and brown with snowmelt. And I used the gravel ford without being asked to, because it seemed like the right thing to do. I called Danny on Sunday as I had said I would, and the Sunday after that. The conversations were short and practical for a while, the way conversations are when 2 people are still figuring out what the distance between them is made of. He told me about his work. I told him about the Breedlove girl and about Clara's first month, and about Bess pulling her hoof out of a mud pocket in the lower pasture and looking at me like I had personally arranged the mud. He laughed at that. It was the first time I had heard him laugh in better than a year, and I held on to it after we hung up and did not examine it too closely, because some things stay in better condition if you leave them alone. The second cup I left out. I want to say that simply, because it is simple. I started making the coffee, putting out 2 cups, filling them both, and leaving the second one. I drank mine by the window. I let the other one go cold. I did not pour it out. It is a small thing, and I cannot fully explain it except to say that it seemed like the right size for what I had been shown. Something had left a line of hemlock branches across a dangerous crossing in 12-degree weather, not because I had earned it or asked for it, but because it had been watching, and it had the means to do something. That is all I know about its reasons, and I hold that lightly, because I am aware that I am interpreting from outside. What I can say is what it looked like from where I was standing, and from where I was standing it looked like care. Specific, deliberate, matched to the shape of the problem. I have told this story twice. Once to Danny, the following autumn, sitting on the porch while Bess stood in the pasture below us, and the leaves were coming down off the ridge in a long, slow pour. He was quiet for a good while after I told it, and then he said, "Do you believe it?" And I said, "I don't have a better explanation." He nodded at that the way a careful person nods when the evidence is stronger than their categories. I understood the nod. I had made it myself, standing on a frozen creek bank in late February, looking at 11 hemlock branches. I still walk the route. I'm slower than I was, and I have handed most of the deliveries to a younger woman in the next county who trained under me. But I still walk the ridge when the weather is workable, partly to keep the trails known, and partly because 32 years of walking a thing has made it part of how I understand where I am. Bess comes with me. She is old now, as mules reckon old, and she walks the uphills carefully, but she walks them. She still leans her head against my shoulder when I take too long at a decision. I use the gravel ford at Flat Creek, every time regardless of the ice. It takes a few minutes longer, and I have never once regretted it. There are mornings when I am walking the ridge in the early dark before the light comes up, and the trees are very still, and the quality of the silence goes from ordinary to that other thing, the present kind. I do not stop, and I do not look around exactly. I just walk the way I walk, at my pace, on the trail I have walked all these years. I do not know what watches from the margin of the hemlocks, or whether what I think I know about that morning has anything true in it, or whether the world contains what I believe it contains. I have stopped needing the answer to any of those questions. That is the clearest thing I can tell you about what changed. Bess will sometimes pause on the trail in those moments of changed silence and lift her head and point her ears at the trees, the way she did at the Flat Creek bank in the dark of that February morning. She is still calm when she does it. She is still tracking something the way she tracks a familiar voice coming from a place she expected it to come from. I watch her do that, and I walk on. The second cup is on the counter when I leave. I go out in the dark with my lamp and Bess at my side, and the ridge is ahead of us the way it has always been. And somewhere in the hemlocks at the top of the first climb, the light begins to come up grey, and then pale gold, and the trail runs on through it, and we walk it. That is all I know how to say about it.